Orville, welcome to Scotland. We're enormously grateful to you for having accepted our invitation to be our guest speaker and to have come and joined us at the Asia-Scotland Institute and brought this beautiful weather with you.
Pleasure.
As you will know, being involved with Asia Society, we share a common sort of mission, namely to equip tomorrow's leaders in Scotland with the knowledge and skills to engage with Asia. And in that respect, I'd be enormously grateful if you could give us an idea of the topics that you're going to be touching on later this afternoon.
Well, I think it would be fair to say that we are at something of a critical moment with China, whether we're Europe, Scotland, the US, whomever, because China is in a very important sort of tipping point moment where how it deports itself towards the world, towards its neighbors in Asia and the rest of us, and how it deals with the whole question of the ongoing challenge of reform at home is still very much in question. So there are a lot of uncertainties that have arisen now, and I think it's critical that we understand them. And they're not easy answers. It isn't as if there's a logical thing that should be done that just people are too unobservant to notice. But it's actually a very sort of complicated topic, which I think will involve a really sort of modulated response of embracing and including and engaging on the other hand, but arching our backs, resistance, and sort of clarifying what it is we're all about and what our interests actually are as this new country continues to arise.
One of the subjects in which everybody obviously will be very interested in is our relationship with China, and particularly in light of the upcoming elections for the new presidency in the United States of America, to what extent US policy towards China may or may not change.
Well, I'd say there are two distinct sort of tributaries feeding into the answer. One is the enigma and the quite alarming prospect of Donald Trump. The only thing I could say about him is he's a kind of a vacuum filled with a lot of hot air, but he is a vacuum. And that may surprise us in ways that he, if he wins, he may be more sort of open to solutions which are almost hard to imagine because he's not a very consistent person. So I wouldn't be too hurried to write him off just as a madman who will run us over the cliff. It's hard to know. Hillary, I understand, I know her, I'm on her advisory council. I would only say this about her. I think her experience as Secretary of State in regard to China was one where she tried extremely hard, as she did with Russia. Remember the reset button she was searching for. And I think she felt very frustrated that she couldn't find more traction to kind of reset the relationship in a more constructive, positive way. So I think she would come into a presidency, if she wins, not closed, but with a certain wariness about whether she actually can do anything more than just very, very sort of moderate recalibrations. But I think her nature would be, if possible, to find some new big ways to engage, but that would have to be reciprocated.
As you know, I mentioned to you that I was in Washington last week, and you and I had had a conversation about Susan Rice and her role, and I wondered if you could expand on that a little and her knowledge and background and those of other key officials in China policy.
You know, while I generally think Obama's done a pretty good job with China policy, I would have to say on the deficit side, there really has been no one like Hank Paulson under George Bush, who had this very close relationship as Secretary of the Treasury with Wang Qishan, the Vice Premier. And it was a very high but second-tier level. And I thought when Obama initially came in, Joe Biden, the vice president, went on 2 trips with Xi Jinping, one to China, one to America. And it seemed like a very logical person to become that sort of designated hitter for China at a high level. but it didn't work out. And Kerry wasn't that interested in China, very preoccupied with other things, Iran, the Middle East. So Susan Rice, National Security Director, was the other possibility. But strangely, until it was a year ago, last November, was her first trip to China in her life. So she didn't have a tremendously highly evolved interest in China. So in a certain way, it then slipped down to a third-tier level. Sure. And I think that's not the best place to have what is clearly the most consequential relationship in the world.
Sure. Orville, the other event that's, of course, on our minds is, other than the presidential elections, is the referendum here about Britain's position in Europe and the Brexit vote. And I'd be very interested in your views on that.
Well, I mean, we have our election in America and you have your Brexit. And they're both very sort of disturbing elections because they have profound implications for so many things. Now, it's interesting, the Chinese have been happy to deal with Europe as Europe, and I think I have seen an occasional comment by Chinese that they would just as soon see Britain leave, but this hasn't been sort of officially enunciated. On the other hand, I do think that in general, the Chinese prefer to deal with individual countries than with giant blocs. Now, Europe has had the virtue of being a giant bloc that isn't so coherent. It's a bit like Sun Yat-sen said of China, you know, a dish of loose sand. But we have to be mindful that that might be something that the Chinese would not be entirely ill-disposed towards.
Well, thank you again for coming to join us. This is event with the Irish Scotland Institute is also with the CBBC, the China-British Business Council. There'll be a lot of business people there who will be again interested in your views and comments on China. And that's a double reason why we are very grateful to you again for coming up to Scotland and being with us today. Thank you.
Pleasure.